Hi everyone. Let me begin by acknowledging our hosts from the Gumatj clan, thanking them for inviting me back again this year and for their welcome to all of us yesterday and today. We've just heard, I think, the stories of some really successful economic enterprises, successful, sustainable, diverse, and really ambitious. You know, the idea of a space centre down the road here, if that's not an image of ambition, I don't know what is an image of ambition. So it's interesting that we've heard of these successes, but everybody who spoke touched on something which is a pretty significant theme when you look at Indigenous economic development anywhere around the country. And there are 5 or 6 of those, and I thought by way of summary, it would be good just to touch on those and perhaps also for people in the audience who are from businesses, to touch on those and invite you to think about the ways in which your businesses may be able to engage with some of these issues. Even just in this small sample we heard here, you can see the diversity of issues that arise in relation to Indigenous economic development. Some communities are highly urban, some are very remote, some are land rich, some are not, some are cash rich, some are not. Some have access to minerals or agribusiness or tourism. Some are really remote and therefore cut off from markets which might be available to others. So there is a range of economic forces that affect what economic development can look like. There are a range of cultural forces that affect the way in which governance might work. And so I think the 6 areas which each of our speakers have touched on are these. First, sustainability. There are a number of issues that arise in relation to sustainable economic development. There are critical cultural issues, and we've heard how in this region those cultural issues can be addressed and addressed very effectively because of the very strong cohesion in the community. In other places in Australia, that is not so straightforward. The social sustainability, again, we heard here about programs that have to create opportunities for women to be in the workforce, things like childcare, things like structures around education. So there's a big cultural and social sustainability question, which communities are best placed to answer. They know what the needs of people in community are, and so those aspects of sustainability are very much community issues. And then the other big issue of sustainability, of course, is economic sustainability. And it doesn't matter whether you're trying to build a not-for-profit business or a for-profit business, economic sustainability is absolutely essential. And it's that last area, economic sustainability, where there can be great challenges. The first of those challenges, and the second theme which we heard people talk about here, is access to capital. How do Indigenous communities and Indigenous businesses gain access to capital? We heard about the issues that arise in relation to land title, tenure, and the ability to raise capital against land, particularly difficult where the land ownership is collective ownership. So there is a need for people and government to think smarter about how access to capital can be facilitated by thinking differently about land and land use and the structures that surround land use, and also to be thinking about alternative financing, mechanisms which allow Indigenous communities to invest in development which bypass some of the traditional land-connected mechanisms. The next theme which arises around the country is looking at the way in which capital is locked up in communities which are in fact quite rich. Communities which have big royalty streams, communities which have trust arrangements, where it's difficult for people within the community to gain access to the community's wealth in order to fund development in the community. And at the Business Council, we've just commenced some work with KPMG and a number of our members to start unpicking some of the features of those trust arrangements and to identify ways in which trusts might be dealt with more flexibly to unlock capital that can be invested locally. Of course, once you start unlocking capital, or once you start changing trust arrangements to make access to capital more easy, then the issue that arises, and an issue that's been touched on by all these gentlemen today, is the issue of governance. A critical issue for economic development is governance and capacity building. And that's often thought about as a kind of a deficit that needs to be addressed, a deficit around the traditional disciplines of business governance that needs to be addressed and can be addressed by businesses making people and skills available to Indigenous businesses. I think it actually flows two ways. There's two levels of governance competence that need to be thought about. One is business competence and the other is cultural competence. And again, that was touched on today. The necessity for people who are from outside community, who are bringing skills and are bringing governance, to have the cultural capacity to actually make a difference in those organisations. So governance is a critical issue, as is general capacity building. And we heard today about the reinvestment that's taking place in training for employees who are workers in these businesses. And one of the things at the Business Council we think where we need to see continued investment is training further up in organisations at the leadership level, at the governance level. And there are lots of businesses already actively involved in that kind of investment. The other aspect, I suppose, around governance and capacity building is the partnerships that Indigenous economic development requires. And we saw that great slide from Nigel of all of the organisations that his businesses are partnering with. And some of those partnerships traditionally have, not in the case of Larrakia, but in other organisations around the country, have not been commercial partnerships. They've been philanthropic partnerships where businesses have been making people available to help build capacity within businesses. But increasingly, those partnerships need to be commercial partnerships. Businesses, Indigenous businesses, doing business with the rest of the business community in Australia. That's something which is being driven by the Commonwealth Government's procurement policies. It's being driven by the BCA's own procurement targets. And we hope that what we will see over time is a continuation of what already exists, genuine partnerships between established businesses across the economy and establishing businesses within economic regions of Australia where predominantly those businesses are going to be Indigenous businesses. To make all of this work, there needs to be some regulatory change. As I mentioned, regulatory change, particularly around trusts, is probably something that's going to be needed. Regulatory change which may incentivise alternative finance sources. So things which may make things like social infrastructure bonds and other mechanisms to finance economic development, to provide incentives to those. Maybe they're going to be tax incentives, maybe they're going to be employment incentives, but there'll need to be some regulatory adjustments, we think, and that's part of the report that the BCA is working on with its partners. The other thing which is needed is infrastructure. I was in a conversation this morning about an opportunity that exists near Alice Springs where there's an agribusiness opportunity, but the road is so bad that all the produce is destroyed before it gets to Alice Springs. It begins as fresh fruit and arrives as fruit juice, apparently. And so there is a need for hard infrastructure for many regions to take full advantage of their economic potential. And digital infrastructure is also critical, or as Marcia likes to refer to it, weird Wi-Fi stuff. If weird Wi-Fi stuff is going to work to drive economic activity, then digital infrastructure needs to be part of the investment. And Klaus, I think, made the reference to the need for continued reinvestment in social infrastructure, things like childcare, healthcare, and other things which are fundamental foundations of economic development. And then lastly, and to finish, the theme I think which came up over and over in the discussions, and I think Charlie in particular mentioned this need for a real desire and determination around economic self-determination, and that is tied to empowerment of communities. And as we heard this morning, the empowerment of communities is directly tied to the recognition of communities, the recognition of First Nations. And so there is a real desire, as we heard here, for people to get on with the serious business of economic development, the serious business of investment in their own communities. And part of that does need the piece of recognition to let it thrive. So that's my summary of this event, and I'm sure you'll join me in thanking everybody who was on the panel. Thank you very much.